I found the earring on a Tuesday morning, wedged between the bathroom sink and the wall. It wasn't mine. I haven't worn dangly jewelry in 3 years, not since I started sleeping poorly and my hands trembled too much to fasten the clasp. The earring was small, delicate, and unmistakably young. Gold. Modern. The kind of thing a woman in her 20s would wear, not someone my age. I stood there in my robe, holding it between my thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated, feeling the weight of it despite its fragile size. My heart was already moving too fast, already doing the calculations my brain refused to complete. I looked in the mirror, my face still the same gray as yesterday, my eyes still carrying the exhaustion of someone who pretends to sleep, and I said out loud, to no one, to everyone, no, that's not possible. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. I had suspected something for months, hadn't I? The way he'd been showering at night, the sudden attention to his appearance, the phone that he kept angled away from me, the late-night work calls that seemed to have a rhythm to them. I had rationalized each sign individually. He was stressed about the business. He was going through a phase. He was worried about his health. When you put them all together, they formed a picture so clear that I couldn't unsee it, even though I had tried desperately not to look. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with that earring still pinched between my fingers and felt something shift in my chest. A settling of acceptance mixed with a sickening rage that I had been too polite, too accommodating, too asleep to notice what had been happening in my own home. My hands started to shake. Not from fear, from the weight of knowing. Listen, if you're hearing this story right now and something in it is resonating with you, something deep and painful and real, I want you to do something for me. I want you to subscribe to this channel because we're bringing you the stories that don't get told in polite company. The stories about betrayal and survival and the moments when your entire life reorganizes itself in the span of a few seconds. If this narrative moved you, if you found yourself thinking about your own life, your own relationships, your own moments of knowing and not knowing, then I want you to hit that like button so that YouTube understands that these stories matter, that people need to hear them, that there's an audience for truth told without apology. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are when you're listening to this. Are you in your car? In bed at night? Are you awake like I was awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when the person next to you became a stranger? Tell me your story. Tell me how you found this. Tell me what broke open for you while you were listening. And if you want to hear how this ended, if you want to know what happened to Isabella and the baby, what happened to my marriage, what happened to my relationship with my daughter, then keep listening because we're not done yet. The earring belonged to Isabella. Of course it did. Who else could it be but the babysitter? The young woman we'd hired 2 years ago to watch the grandchildren while my daughter worked. The one who had become so seamlessly woven into our family that she practically lived here. Isabella, with her dark curly hair and her easy laugh, who sat at our dinner table and ate my food and held my grandchildren with such tenderness that I'd thought, more than once, how wonderful it must be to be her age, to have that kind of softness still intact. Isabella, who I'd bought a winter coat for when I saw her shivering on the porch, who I'd helped fill out paperwork for a green card, who I'd trusted so completely that I'd given her a key to every room in this house. My husband had been with her, in my home, in our bed, while I lay 3 doors down, pretending to sleep because I was too tired, or too afraid, to confront the slow disappearance of whatever we'd once been. I must have made a sound, because my husband appeared in the bathroom doorway, already dressed in his expensive gym clothes, the ones he'd started wearing obsessively over the past year. He was holding his phone and his keys, ready to leave for his morning run, which he took every night around 11 p.m., which made no sense, which I had stopped questioning. He saw the earring in my hand and his face did something I had never seen before. It went completely blank, like someone had reached in and erased every trace of emotion. For maybe 2 seconds, we just looked at each other. And in that silence, every lie we'd been telling each other crystallized into something solid and permanent. "That's not what you think," he said, which was perhaps the most insulting thing he could have said because what I thought was becoming terrifyingly clear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw that earring at him. Instead, I very calmly put it in my pocket and smiled. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't do any of the things a woman is supposed to do when she discovers her marriage is a performance stage for an audience that doesn't exist. Instead, I spent the entire day watching, really watching, how he moved through our house when he checked his phone, how his leg bounced with anxiety through lunch, how he kept finding excuses to leave the room. I made notes in my phone with the detachment of a scientist. 11:47 p.m. last night. He leaves for work. Returns at 1:23 a.m. He never worked that late before this year. I realized that I had data points going back months, maybe longer. Text messages I'd glimpsed over his shoulder. Strange charges on the credit card I didn't fully investigate. Nights when he came home smelling like a cologne that wasn't his. How many times had I known and chosen not to know? The realization was worse than the earring. At least the earring was evidence. My complicit ignorance was something else entirely. It was a mirror I couldn't turn away from. That night, I lay in bed next to him and felt like I was sharing a mattress with a stranger. His breathing came in the regular pattern of someone pretending to sleep, same as me, and I understood suddenly that we had both become excellent liars. He was lying to me. I was lying to myself, and we were both lying to the grandchildren, who came over most days and followed Isabella around the house like she was magic. She was something safe. I thought about my granddaughter, 8 years old, still soft with childhood, still believing that the world was basically good, and I thought about how fragile that was, how easily it could be shattered. I realized that night that I couldn't stay in this bed anymore. Not like this, not pretending, not while he was still bringing her here, still walking through our house, still stealing moments in rooms where my grandchildren slept. I got up at 3 a.m. and went to my office and began to make a plan. Not a plan to confront him. Not yet. A plan to make sure that when this broke open, it broke in a way that couldn't be ignored or rationalized or explained away. I called my daughter the next morning from my car, parked in the grocery store lot where no one could hear me. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't, not yet. But I told her I needed her to pay attention to the children. I said the word careful 3 times, as if repetition could transfer the weight of what I knew into her understanding without actually saying it. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes, which was another lie in a series of lies that had become my vocabulary. I told her I loved her and hung up before she could ask more questions. Then I sat in my car for 20 minutes with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel, and I thought about the woman my daughter was. Strong, observant, ruthless when she needed to be. And I thought about how hard this was going to hurt her. She idolized her father, not in the blind way children sometimes do, but in the way adult daughters do when they've made peace with their father's flaws and decided to love him anyway. This was going to shatter that peace. I need to tell you about the moment Isabella's pregnancy revealed itself, because that's when everything stopped being about me and started being about something darker, something that required a different kind of rage. My daughter called me, not me calling her first, but her, panicked, saying that Isabella had seemed sick at breakfast, that she'd rushed to the bathroom, that she'd been acting strange all week. My daughter had taken her to a clinic, and the nurse had asked if she could get permission from her parents before discussing the results. Isabella, confused and frightened, had said her parents were in Colombia, that she was alone here, that the permission wasn't necessary. The clinic worker, a woman I will never know but will be forever grateful to, had recognized the signs of someone without protection, without a safety net, without anyone watching over her welfare. She had made a choice to violate protocol and called my daughter instead, which is how we found out that Isabella was 8 weeks pregnant. I was in the kitchen when my daughter told me, and I remember the sound of the knife hitting the cutting board stopped mid-motion. My hands went numb. For a moment, I couldn't even process what I was hearing, and then it all came crashing in at once. The earring, the late nights, the showers, the phone, the cologne, all of it forming a narrative so complete and so vile that I had to sit down. My daughter was saying something about the father, about whether Isabella knew who it was, and I heard myself say very quietly from somewhere far away, "It's your father." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens before an earthquake, before the world splits open. I could hear my daughter's breathing change. I could hear her processing. I could hear the moment she understood what her father had done. And I could hear something else too. The sound of her childhood faith in him, cracking and crumbling and turning to ash. We didn't discuss what to do immediately. We couldn't. The information was too large, too poisonous, and it required a kind of cold planning that neither of us was ready for. But that night, I did something that I had been building toward since I found that earring. I started preparing for the performance. I began leaving small notes around the house, just fragments, nothing coherent, about people coming into our home at night, about voices I didn't recognize, about feeling confused about what was real and what wasn't. I left them on the nightstand, on the bathroom mirror, in the kitchen. I started asking my husband during the day about things that had happened at night, about people he'd been talking to, with a confused, worried tone in my voice. I was painting myself as someone whose grip on reality was loosening, whose mind was becoming unreliable, whose fear was manifesting as confusion and paranoia. My daughter helped me, though it broke her heart. She would call, and I would talk loudly about being scared, about not sleeping, about seeing things that weren't there. She would come over and find those notes and give me a look that said both, "I believe you," and "I'm sorry we're doing this." And then she would hold my hand and we would sit together in the conspiracy of what we were about to do. My grandchildren didn't understand yet. They just thought Grandma was having a weird week. They didn't know that every confused statement I was making was a brick in the wall we were building around my husband, a wall that would trap him in his own lie. They didn't know that their mother and their grandmother were preparing to burn everything down, and they were going to be caught in the flames whether they understood it now or not. The night I called the police, I had dressed myself carefully in confusion. I wore an old nightgown with stains on it. I hadn't combed my hair. I called at 2:47 a.m., my voice shaking with what could have been fear, but was actually the precise calibration of rage refined into performance. I told the dispatcher that there was a man in my house, that I didn't know who he was, that he kept coming and going through the night, that I thought he was stealing, that I was scared. I said I had dementia, though I never used that word. I just made sure my speech patterns were scattered, that I repeated myself, that I sounded like someone whose mind was fragmenting in real time. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me. I heard the sound of sirens approaching, getting closer, and I felt my heart doing something complicated. It was fear and satisfaction and terrible, terrible power all mixed together. When the police arrived, I was sitting in the living room with all the lights on, wringing my hands. My husband came down the stairs confused, angry, demanding to know what was happening. I looked at him, and I didn't see the man I'd married. I saw a predator. I saw someone who had made a calculated choice to manipulate a young woman who had no protection, no family here, no safety net. I saw someone who had built an empire of lies so carefully that he'd forgotten there were consequences for people like him. And as the police walked through the house, I stayed very still and very quiet and very scared, because that's what a woman with dementia would do. They found her on the way upstairs. Isabella, half-dressed, confused, trying to understand what was happening. They found her coming out of the bedroom. And suddenly, the performance didn't matter anymore, because the truth was so obvious that no amount of denying could make it disappear. He tried to talk his way out of it. I remember that. He told the police that there was a simple explanation, that she had called him in distress, that he was helping a family friend. He looked at me with such betrayal in his eyes, as if I was the villain in this story, as if my refusal to keep his secret was some kind of cruelty. One of the officers, a woman with tired eyes and the expression of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out 1,000 times, asked him why the family friend was half naked in their bedroom at 2:47 a.m. He didn't have an answer. Isabella was crying, asking what was happening, asking if she was going to be deported, if this was going to go on her record, if this meant she couldn't stay in the country. And I felt something shift in me. The rage I'd been nursing started to transform into something else, something more complicated, because I suddenly understood that she was also a victim, that she had also been betrayed, that she had been the one doing the real losing. The police took her away. They took him away too, though they treated him completely differently. They were gentle with him, explaining his rights to him, talking about lawyers and statements. They treated Isabella like she was the criminal, despite the fact that she was the one being exploited, the one with no power, the one whose entire life in this country was now at risk because she had been seduced by someone with authority and resources and the kind of money that could make problems disappear or multiply depending on how he directed it. I watched from my window as they put her in the car, and I watched her look back at our house, at the home where she had worked and trusted and been taken advantage of. And I saw the exact moment her face broke. That's when I realized that my revenge had costs that I hadn't fully calculated. That in trying to destroy my husband, I had also destroyed the young woman he had used. After they took him away, I sat in my kitchen, and I didn't perform anymore. The confusion dropped away and I was just myself, angry, exhausted, empty. My daughter came over within the hour. She found me staring at nothing, at the place where Isabella's coat usually hung, at the hooks where she had carved her initials one afternoon while we were having tea. My daughter didn't ask if I was okay. She just put her arms around me, and we stood there together, holding on to each other like we were the only solid things left in a world that had liquefied. She told me that the police had called, that they were building a case, that there were text messages, there were other women. There was a pattern going back much further than either of us had realized. But there was something worse than the infidelity, worse than the predation. There was the question of what Isabella was going to do about the baby. She was pregnant with my husband's child. She had no family here. She had no money. She had no protection. She was going to be tied to him forever through this child, and that child would be a permanent reminder of what he had taken from her. My daughter and I made a decision that night. We were going to help her, not because we owed her, but because she had been used by someone we loved and trusted. And the least we could do was acknowledge that and try to mitigate the damage. The next day, when everything became public, when my daughter finally asked the question that had been burning between us since the police left, "How long did you know?" I had to tell her the truth. I had to tell her that I had known about the other babysitters, not the ones before. There had been a pattern, and I had seen it, and I had chosen to protect my marriage instead of protecting those women. I had rationalized it as not my place to interfere, not my business what my husband did, not my responsibility to police his behavior. I had been complicit through silence. I had been a collaborator in his predation through my refusal to act. And my daughter had to face the fact that her mother, the woman she thought was strong and protective, had been a coward. She didn't speak to me for a week after that confession. She took the children to her mother's, to her own house, and she didn't call. The silence was worse than any confrontation could have been. But then one day she came back, and she found me in the garden, and she sat down next to me without saying anything at first. And then she said very quietly, "I understand why you were scared. I understand why you didn't know what to do. But I need you to know that that understanding doesn't erase what happened. It just means I'm choosing to forgive you while also holding you accountable." That was my daughter, practical, fierce, capable of holding two contradictory truths at the same time. She had inherited that from me, I think, or maybe I had learned it from her. The grandchildren knew something had changed. They asked about Isabella. They asked where their grandfather was. They asked questions that I couldn't fully answer because the truth was too large for their minds to hold. My granddaughter, that 8-year-old I had worried about, asked me one afternoon if the grandfather had done something bad, and I told her the truth in age-appropriate language. I told her that sometimes grown-ups hurt people they should protect, and sometimes the people we love do things that are wrong. And sometimes we have to make hard choices about whether to keep loving them anyway. She nodded very seriously. She was filing this information away for later processing. And then she asked if Isabella was okay. I had to tell her that I didn't know. That was the hardest part of all of this. The not knowing, the uncertainty, the lack of control over outcomes. The weeks after the arrest were a blur of police statements and lawyer consultations and documents that seemed to multiply like they were breeding in the filing cabinets of various offices throughout the city. My husband's lawyer was expensive and sharp and completely committed to making this all go away, which meant making Isabella into a liar, into someone who had seduced him, into a calculating woman who had gotten herself pregnant to trap him. I watched this strategy unfold with a kind of sick fascination because it was so predictable, so perfectly choreographed, so exactly what I would have expected from someone whose entire existence was built on manipulation. The lawyer sent letters to Isabella's address. She was staying at a women's shelter by then, offering her money if she would recant her statements. She never responded. She was smarter than he was, even if she didn't have his resources. She understood that once you start negotiating with predators, you've already lost. My daughter was investigating on her own. She's always been like that, incapable of accepting official narratives, always digging deeper, always assuming there was something else underneath. She hired her own private investigator, someone she knew from work, and what he found was a trail of women going back 15 years. Not just babysitters. There was a yoga instructor who had suddenly quit her job. There was a receptionist at his office who had taken an extended leave and never come back. There was a dental hygienist who had worked at his preferred dentist and had been moved to a different location. Each woman had something in common. They were young, they were vulnerable in some way, they had limited support systems, they had something to lose if they spoke up. He had selected them the way a predator selects prey, with patience and precision and an almost academic understanding of exploitation. The investigator brought all of this information to the police, and suddenly the case against my husband became much larger. It wasn't just about Isabella. It was about a pattern of sexual exploitation that had been happening for years, right under the noses of a community that wanted to believe he was a respectable man. The police started reaching out to the other women, and some of them agreed to speak, and others didn't. Some of them had moved on, had built new lives, had decided that reopening these wounds wasn't worth whatever justice might come from pressing charges. But enough of them came forward that the case became almost airtight. He had done this systematically. He had done it knowingly. He had done it with the full confidence of someone who had never imagined there would be consequences. What I didn't anticipate was how the discovery of these other women would affect my daughter. She came to me one afternoon with this exhausted, devastated look on her face, and she said, "Mom, I need you to tell me if this happened when I was young. I need you to tell me if Dad ever did anything to my friends, to my babysitters, to anyone in our house when I was growing up." I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that her entire childhood had been built on a foundation of his predation, that the safety she had felt was illusory, that she had been playing in rooms where terrible things were happening just out of her line of sight. I had to sit down before I answered her because the weight of what she was asking was too much to carry while standing. I told her the truth, which was that I knew of at least one incident when she was in high school. A girl who had babysat for her younger cousins, who had suddenly stopped coming around, who her father said had gotten involved with the wrong crowd. I had seen text messages between them that made me uncomfortable at the time, but I had rationalized it as nothing serious, as harmless flirtation, as something I didn't want to know more about. I had been 25 years younger then, less confident, more willing to accept his explanations for things. I had been a different kind of complicit than I was now. My daughter listened to this, and her face went through a series of transformations. Shock, anger, grief, and finally a kind of hardened resolution. She told me that she was going to talk to that woman, that she wanted to know if anything had happened, and that if it had, she wanted her to know that there were people who believed her now, people who had proof, people who could help. That woman, I'll call her Sarah, had never spoken to anyone about what happened. She had kept it locked inside for 20 years, had married, had children, had built a life that looked normal from the outside, but that had been quietly shaped by trauma. When my daughter reached out to her, Sarah broke down. She told her about the grooming, about how it had started with special attention and compliments, and made her feel like she was being seen by an important man. She told her about the night in the guest room, about how she had frozen instead of fighting because she was raised not to make a scene, not to be rude, not to accuse men of things they denied. She told her about how she had never told anyone because she was afraid of not being believed, afraid of her reputation being destroyed, afraid of what it would mean if she admitted that she had allowed this to happen to her. My daughter called me after that conversation, and she was weeping with a rage so pure and so justified that it made me ashamed. She said, "He stole her adolescence, Mom. He stole her sense of safety. And you fucking knew, and you did nothing." I couldn't defend myself because she was right. I had known, and I had chosen my own comfort over her protection. I had prioritized keeping peace in my marriage over keeping a young girl safe from predation. And now, 20 years later, that woman was still carrying the weight of what had been done to her, still struggling with the consequences, still trying to figure out how to tell her own daughter about the trauma that had been passed down to her through the choices of a man she had trusted. My complicity wasn't just about the present. It had consequences that rippled backward and forward through time, affecting everyone it touched. The charges against my husband kept mounting. Sexual exploitation of a subordinate, attempted coercion, fraud related to his denial of paternity. There were discussions of immigration violations related to how he had used Isabella's precarious status to control her. His lawyer kept trying to negotiate plea deals, kept trying to make this go away quietly with a settlement, kept trying to spin a narrative where everyone could walk away and pretend this had never happened. But the prosecutor, a woman named Martinez who had the exhausted intensity of someone who had prosecuted too many cases like this, wasn't interested in deals. She saw what I saw. A man who had built his entire life on the ability to manipulate systems and people, and she was determined to dismantle that. Isabella agreed to testify. That was the moment I understood that she had more courage than I had been giving her credit for. She was pregnant, vulnerable, undocumented in terms of her actual status. The green card application was still pending, and she was willing to stand up in court and detail what had happened to her. She was willing to face cross-examination from his lawyer, willing to have her credibility attacked, willing to expose herself to the possibility that no one would believe her. My daughter and I went to support her at the trial. We sat behind her in the gallery, and we made sure she could see us whenever she looked back. I wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that we believed her, that the community that had failed to protect her was now standing witness to her truth. The testimony was brutal. Listening to Isabella detail the ways he had isolated her, the promises he had made about leaving me, the conversations about how young she was and how that made her easier to manage, it was like watching someone lay out the architecture of predation brick by brick. He had told her that she was special. He had told her that what was happening between them was love. He had told her that if she told anyone, he would make sure she was deported. He had leveraged her vulnerability with such precision that it was almost mathematical in its cruelty. And as she was testifying, my granddaughter was in school learning about fractions and friendship, completely unaware that her sense of safety was being recalibrated by what she had witnessed in this house before the truth came out. One afternoon, between trial sessions, I took Isabella to lunch. We sat in a quiet restaurant, and I looked at this young woman who had become unexpectedly central to the destruction of my marriage, and I said something that I had been rehearsing in my head for weeks. "I'm sorry that I didn't protect you. I'm sorry that I knew my husband was capable of things like this, and I didn't act. I'm sorry that you had to be the one to pay the price for my cowardice." She listened to this, and her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "I also want you to know that I loved this baby. Even when I was scared, even when I knew what he had done, I wanted to keep this baby. But I also need to know that I'm not going to be alone, that you're going to be here." I promised her that I would be. I promised her that when the baby came, she would have support, financial, emotional, practical. I promised her that I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to undo some of the damage that my silence had allowed to happen. She looked at me and she said, "The damage isn't your fault. He did this, not you." But that's where she was wrong. I had done it too, just through omission instead of commission. I had been part of the architecture of her exploitation through my willingness to look away. The verdict came down on a Thursday in October. Guilty on all counts. Sexual exploitation of a subordinate employee. Attempted coercion. My husband was sentenced to 8 years in prison, which meant he would be released in his early 70s, which meant that in some ways his life was effectively over. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt justified. Instead, I felt hollow. Because the verdict didn't actually change anything. Isabella was still pregnant with his child. Sarah was still carrying the trauma of her adolescence. The other women were still reckoning with what had been taken from them. And my grandchildren were still growing up in a world where they had learned that the people you trust most can hurt you in ways that are impossible to predict or prevent. The baby was born in March. A boy. Isabella named him Diego. I was there when he was born, in the delivery room, holding Isabella's hand while she pushed this new human into the world. My daughter was there too, on Isabella's other side, whispering encouragement. And when that baby came out and I saw him for the first time, I felt something break open in my chest. He was beautiful and innocent, and he was also going to grow up marked by this story, tied to a father he would never really know, carrying the weight of his paternity like a scar. I held him after Isabella had rested for a moment, and I looked into his unfocused newborn eyes, and I made a silent promise that I was going to do everything in my power to make sure he didn't become his father. My daughter started a legal fund for Isabella. She didn't ask my permission. She just set it up one afternoon and sent me the link. Within 2 weeks, we had raised enough money to get Isabella a good lawyer, someone who specialized in immigration cases and could navigate the complexity of her status while also securing custody arrangements that protected her and Diego from my husband's reach. The lawyer was a woman named Chen, and she was relentless in a way that reminded me of my daughter. She filed for full custody, filed for child support that would be paid directly to Isabella regardless of my husband's incarceration status, filed for a protective order that prevented him from having any contact with the child until Diego was 18 and could make that choice himself. My husband tried to fight it. He tried to claim that Isabella was manipulating the system, that she was using the child as leverage, that he had rights as a father. The judge looked at him with such contempt that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The grandchildren processed this in their own ways. My grandson, who was 11 when everything happened, became quieter, more withdrawn. He started having panic attacks about being alone with any adult, started asking questions about whether people were good or bad in ways that suggested he was rebuilding his entire moral framework from scratch. My granddaughter, the 8-year-old who had once asked the babysitter why she kissed her grandfather like that, started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming about people in her room, about someone trying to take her, about being unsafe in spaces that should have been safe. My daughter took her to a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, and the therapist told us that what the children had witnessed, the violation of boundaries, the betrayal of trust, the collapse of the adult world they had believed was protecting them, was traumatizing in ways that would take years to fully process. I attended every therapy session that my daughter allowed me to attend. I sat in waiting rooms and I watched my grandchildren walk in with shoulders curved inward, looking smaller than they actually were. I watched them come out with red eyes and expressions that looked like they had been aged by decades in the span of an hour. And I understood, with a clarity that was painful, that my complicity had cost them something that couldn't be measured in money or years. I had allowed them to be exposed to a predator because I was too afraid to disrupt the surface of my marriage. I had prioritized my own comfort over their sense of safety. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. One evening, my granddaughter asked to talk to me alone. We sat on the back porch, and she was very quiet for a long time before she spoke. She said, "Grandma, did you know that Grandpa was doing bad things?" I told her the truth. I told her that I had suspected he was doing something, and that I hadn't acted on my suspicion in the way I should have. I told her that I was sorry. She listened to this, and then she said, "Are you a bad person?" The question was so direct, so unfiltered by the social niceties that adults use to protect each other's feelings, that I had to really consider it. I told her, "I did a bad thing. That doesn't make me a bad person. But it means I have to spend the rest of my life trying to be better than I was." She seemed to accept this answer, though I could see her filing it away, processing it, deciding what she would do with this information about her grandmother. She asked if I still lived with Grandpa, and I realized that no one had actually told the children that I had moved out. I had left that house 3 weeks after the arrest, and I had been living in my daughter's guest house since then. But somehow, in the chaos of everything, The children hadn't registered this change. I told her that I didn't live with Grandpa anymore, that Grandpa was going to be away for a very long time, that she was safe. She nodded very seriously, and then she asked if I was friends with Isabella now. I told her that Isabella was someone I was trying very hard to be there for, someone I was trying to help, someone who had been hurt by someone we both loved. She said, "Good," because she was nice to us. She was really nice to us. The visits with my husband stopped. I didn't go to see him in prison. My daughter didn't go. The children didn't go. I made the decision very consciously that I was done performing for him, done pretending that the bonds of marriage or family were stronger than the reality of what he had done. My lawyer told me to file for divorce, and I did, efficiently and without drama. The paperwork was processed. The marriage that had lasted 32 years was dissolved in a matter of months. He contested nothing because his lawyer had advised him that contesting would only make things worse for him in terms of sentencing and public perception. So we divided assets with the cold precision of people who no longer saw each other as human beings worthy of negotiation. I kept the house. My daughter insisted on this, said that I needed a space that was completely mine, and the rest was split with mathematical accuracy. Isabella and Diego moved into an apartment that we helped her secure. My daughter and I furnished it together, picking out things that were sturdy and beautiful, and that sent the message that this space was a place where healing could happen. Isabella got her green card application approved. The lawyer had leveraged the case against my husband to demonstrate the abuse and exploitation she had suffered, which apparently counted as grounds for a special visa for victims of crime. She started working as a nanny for another family, a position that was temporary but that bought her time and dignity and a paycheck that was hers alone. She would bring Diego over to visit sometimes, and I would hold him, and I would tell him stories about his mother's strength, about how she had survived something terrible and had become powerful through that survival. One afternoon, my daughter did something that I wasn't expecting. She came to me with a box of old photographs, and she said she wanted to talk about our family history, about the patterns that had allowed my husband to function for so long without real consequences. She had been doing research, talking to relatives, piecing together a story that went much deeper than any of us had realized. She told me that our grandfather, my father-in-law, had a similar pattern, that there were women in the family history who had disappeared or been institutionalized or simply stopped being spoken about, that what my husband had done wasn't an aberration. It was a pattern. It was inherited. It was systematic. This knowledge was almost harder to bear than the initial betrayal. Because if it was inherited, if it was systematic, if it was embedded in the structure of our family itself, then that meant it could happen again. That meant that my grandson, growing up with this knowledge about his grandfather, might wonder if he carried this capacity inside him. That meant that the cycles didn't end with one man going to prison. They echoed backward and forward through generations. My daughter understood this too. She told me that this was why she was determined to raise her children differently, to talk to them openly about power and exploitation and consent, to break the pattern at its root. We started a support group, my daughter and I and some of the other women who came forward. We met in a church basement once a week, and we talked about what had happened to us, what we had allowed to happen, what we were trying to do to prevent it from happening again. Isabella came sometimes. Sarah came. The dental hygienist came. We were a small group of women bound together by our connection to a man who had exploited each of us in different ways. But more than that, we were bound together by our commitment to speaking truth and supporting each other through the aftermath of that truth. I listened to these women talk about their lives, about the ways they were rebuilding, about the small victories and the ongoing struggles, and I understood that my role in this group wasn't to be the elder statesman or the one with answers. My role was to witness and to hold space and to say repeatedly, "I believe you. Your experience was real. Your pain matters." A year after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from my husband. It was forwarded to me through his lawyer, and it was several pages long, written in his careful handwriting. He wrote about remorse. He wrote about how he had been struggling with his own demons, how he had made choices that were wrong, how he understood now the damage he had caused. He wrote about how he thought about the children constantly, how he wished he could undo what had happened. He asked if I could forgive him. He asked if I thought my daughter might ever forgive him. He asked if he could have some form of contact with Diego, the biological son he had never publicly acknowledged, when he was released from prison. I read this letter 3 times. I sat with it. I felt the pull of it, the desire to believe that he was truly remorseful, that maybe there was some path to redemption here. But then I thought about Isabella, about what it would mean for her if the man who had exploited her regained any kind of power over her or her son. I thought about my grandchildren, about whether exposure to their grandfather's supposed remorse would undo the work of their therapy, undo the slow process of rebuilding their sense of safety. I thought about my daughter, about the strength it was taking her to move forward without bitterness consuming her alive. And I wrote him back, just a short letter, saying that his remorse didn't erase what he had done. That contact with Diego was not going to happen while Diego was a child and could not consent to it. That I was working on forgiveness, but that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation or trust or any restoration of relationship. I sent that letter, and I felt lighter afterward. The day Isabella told Diego about his father was a day I will never forget, even though I wasn't physically present for it. She called me afterward, her voice small and shaky, and she told me what she had said to her 4-year-old son. She had told him that his father was a man who had made very bad choices, that those choices meant he couldn't be with Diego right now, that it wasn't Diego's fault, and it never would be. She told him that she loved him more than anything, that she had chosen to have him even knowing the circumstances, that he was wanted and precious and safe. And Diego, in the way that children do, had asked, "Is Daddy a bad guy?" And Isabella had to find the words to explain that sometimes people do bad things without being entirely bad, that sometimes people hurt others because they are broken themselves, but that the hurt they cause is still real and still wrong. She was trying to navigate the impossible terrain of being honest with her son, while also not poisoning him against his own biology. I went to see her that afternoon. She was in the kitchen making Diego's favorite snack, platanos fritos with a little bit of cinnamon sugar, and her hands were shaking. I held her while she cried, and I understood that this was a moment of profound grief for her. She was mourning not just what had been taken from her, but what had been taken from Diego. He would grow up without a father, or worse, he would grow up with the knowledge of who his father was, and the understanding that his father had chosen his own desires over his son's well-being. That was a particular kind of abandonment that couldn't be healed by money or legal protections or the love of a good mother. It could only be survived. My relationship with my daughter during this period was complicated and tender in ways I had never experienced before. She was holding me accountable while also showing me mercy. She was allowing me to be part of her children's lives while also making it clear that trust was something I had to rebuild through consistent action over time. She was teaching me, through her example, what it looked like to be angry and disappointed with someone you love while also choosing to stay in relationship with them. One afternoon, she said to me, "I've been thinking about what you said about your complicity by omission, and I want you to know that I believe you're genuinely sorry. But I also need you to understand that sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't undo what happened. Sorry is just the beginning of actually doing the work to be different." I told her that I understood, and I did. I was beginning to understand that redemption wasn't a destination you reached. It was a practice. It was something you did every single day for the rest of your life. I started volunteering with an organization that supported undocumented immigrant women who had experienced sexual exploitation. I spent 2 afternoons a week in a small office helping women navigate the legal system, helping them understand their rights, helping them connect with resources. I wasn't qualified for most of this work. I had no formal training, no credentials, but I had something else. I had experience, I had made mistakes, I had been complicit. And I could sit with other women who were in similar situations, and I could say, "I understand the impulse to protect your family even when your family is hurting you. I understand why you might choose silence. But I'm here to tell you that silence costs more than you think it does. The women I worked with taught me things that no amount of therapy could have taught me. They taught me about resilience. They taught me about what it looked like to rebuild a life from nothing. They taught me that strength often looked like vulnerability. Sarah, the woman my daughter had tracked down, became a close friend. She started speaking publicly about her experience, about the grooming, about the assault, about the 30 years of silence that followed. She wrote a blog post that went viral. Thousands of people reading her story, relating to it, thanking her for telling it. And she credited my daughter with giving her permission to speak, with believing her, with helping her understand that her silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was just allowing the pattern to continue. She and my daughter started giving talks together at universities and high schools, educating young people about the signs of predatory behavior, about how to recognize it, how to report it, how to support survivors. I attended one of these talks, and I watched my daughter speak about her father with such clear-eyed compassion that I felt something shift in my understanding of who my daughter was and what she was capable of. The grandchildren continued their therapy. Slowly, incrementally, they began to rebuild their sense of safety. My grandson started having fewer panic attacks. My granddaughter's nightmares decreased in frequency. They would come to my house, my own house now, which felt important, and they would play in ways that seemed more like normal childhood play. But there was a guardedness that hadn't been there before. They were watchful in ways that children shouldn't have to be. They noticed things. They asked questions about whether adults could be trusted. These were the scars that remained, the parts of them that had been permanently altered by what they had witnessed. I bought a small apartment in the same complex where Isabella lived, not to intrude on her space, but to be close enough to help, close enough to be part of Diego's life in a consistent and practical way. I became the person who picked him up from daycare on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I became the person who made him dinner and helped him with his homework and held him when he had nightmares. He was growing up with a kind of knowledge that no child should have to carry, but he was also growing up surrounded by women who loved him, who had chosen him, who had decided that his life was worth investing in despite the circumstances of his conception. I wanted him to know that he was not defined by his father's choices. I wanted him to know that he was loved. 2 years after the trial, I received news that my husband had been diagnosed with cancer while in prison. Prostate cancer, advanced, likely to be terminal. My first emotion was relief, which shocked me with its intensity. I felt relief that he would no longer be in the world, that eventually there would be one less predator, that his death would mean Diego could grow up without the possibility of his father re-entering his life. But alongside that relief was something more complicated, a recognition that even in his death, this man was going to continue to affect the lives he had damaged. He was going to die, and my grandchildren would have to process that. My daughter would have to feel whatever complex emotions came with losing a parent who had hurt her so profoundly. Isabella would have to manage Diego's questions about whether it was appropriate to mourn someone who had exploited her. I didn't visit him as he was dying. My daughter didn't either. But my granddaughter asked if she could write him a letter. She wanted to tell him, she said, how he had made her feel, how he had violated her sense of safety, how she was going to be okay anyway, how she was going to survive what he had done and become the kind of person who protected others instead of hurting them. I helped her write it, and we sent it to the prison, and I don't know if he read it before he died. I hope he did. I hope it meant something to him. But more than that, I hope that the act of writing it meant something to her, that it was part of her process of reclaiming power over a narrative that had been written for her without her consent. He died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years almost to the day after Diego was born. I didn't cry when I heard the news, which surprised me. I had expected to feel something, sadness, regret, loss, but what I felt instead was a kind of closure, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but an ending, a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been running on for too long. My daughter asked me if I wanted to attend the funeral, and I told her no. I told her that I was going to spend that day with Isabella and Diego instead. I was going to take them to the park, and we were going to feed the ducks, and we were going to talk about whatever Diego wanted to talk about. We were going to build a memory that had nothing to do with the man who had just died, and everything to do with the life that Isabella had created despite his exploitation. My daughter understood. She told me that she wasn't going either, that she was going to stay home with her children, and she was going to talk to them about death and grief, and how we process the loss of people who hurt us. She was going to help them understand that it was okay to feel complicated things, that you could mourn someone while also acknowledging that their death made the world safer. When Diego turned 5 years old, Isabella threw him a birthday party in the apartment complex where we all lived. She had saved money for months to make it special. A piñata shaped like a dinosaur, decorations in his favorite colors, a cake that she had baked herself with my help the night before. I watched my grandchildren play with Diego, watched them laugh without the guardedness that had become their default. And I understood that this moment of joy, of normalcy, of childhood being allowed to be childhood, was what all of this had been for. It was what the confrontation was for. It was what the court cases were for. It was what the years of therapy and processing and difficult conversations had been building toward. It was the possibility of a future where these children could simply be happy without constantly monitoring whether happiness was safe. My daughter pulled me aside during the party, and she told me something that she had been sitting with for a while. She told me that she had decided to write a book about what happened, about the patterns in our family, about the way that complicity and silence had allowed predation to flourish for generations. She told me that she wanted my permission to tell my story as part of that narrative, to detail my role in it, to be honest about the ways I had failed and the ways I had tried to make amends. She told me that she understood if I said no, that I might want to keep this private, that going public with this meant living with the exposure forever. I told her yes immediately. I told her that if my story, if my failures and my complicity and my eventual action could help even one person recognize the signs of exploitation in their own life, then it was worth the exposure. I told her that silence was how this had survived for so long, and that breaking silence was the only way to actually break the cycle. Over the next year, my daughter interviewed me for hours. She asked me questions about what I had known and when I had known it. She asked me about the moments where I had chosen not to act. She asked me about the fear that had kept me paralyzed. She asked me about the rage that eventually broke through. She recorded everything, transcribed everything, wove it all together into a narrative that was unflinching in its honesty. I read the manuscript when she finished it, and I had to sit down multiple times because seeing my own complicity laid out so clearly, seeing my own rationalizations dismantled, seeing the consequences of my inaction detailed so precisely, it was like reliving the entire experience all over again. But I also understood that this was important. This was the documentation that needed to exist. This was the evidence that could help other people. Isabella decided to go back to school. She enrolled in community college with the intention of becoming a social worker, someone who could work with immigrant women and help them navigate the systems that had been designed to exploit them. She would study in the evenings while Diego slept, would wake up exhausted but determined, would spend her days working as a nanny and her nights working toward a future that had nothing to do with my husband, that was entirely her own construction. I helped her with childcare while she studied. I would pick Diego up from daycare, and we would do homework together, and we would make dinner, and we would read stories until he fell asleep. These mundane acts of care felt revolutionary to me. They felt like I was rebuilding something. I was putting my hands to work on fixing what had been broken. Sarah started a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of sexual exploitation. She called it Visible, which she explained meant that survivors were seen, that their experiences were valid, that they didn't have to hide anymore. My daughter became the board chair. I became a volunteer, helping to organize support groups, helping to develop educational materials, helping to train other volunteers in how to work with survivors. We brought Isabella on staff as soon as she graduated from community college. She became the director of immigrant services, which meant she was the person who could communicate with women in Spanish, who understood the specific vulnerabilities of undocumented immigrants, who could sit with a woman and say, "I know what this is like because I lived it." Her presence on the staff changed everything. Women who had been terrified to come forward started calling because they knew that someone who understood their particular situation would be on the other end of the line. My granddaughter started a support group at her middle school for children who had experienced trauma or witnessed trauma in their homes. She was 12 years old, and she was already doing the work of healing her own community. She would come to me sometimes, and she would talk about the kids she was listening to, about the stories they were telling her, about how many of them had experienced violations of their sense of safety that they had never told anyone about. I watched this young woman, who had herself been violated in subtle but profound ways by witnessing her grandfather's predation, channel her pain into action. She was becoming an advocate. She was becoming exactly the kind of person that my complicity had tried to prevent her from becoming. My grandson was quieter about his processing, but no less intentional. He became interested in law, in understanding how systems worked, in figuring out where the gaps were that allowed people like his grandfather to function for so long without real consequences. He would bring me articles he had found, court cases he was reading, policy proposals that he thought could help prevent this kind of exploitation. He was 12 years old, and he was already engaged in the intellectual work of dismantling the systems that had protected his grandfather. I would listen to him talk about these things, and I would feel such pride mixed with such sorrow, because I understood that he should never have had to develop this kind of sophistication about predation at such a young age. The book my daughter wrote was published 2 years after the party in the apartment complex. It was picked up by a major publisher who understood the cultural moment we were in, who recognized that this was a story that needed to be told and heard. The publication brought attention to the case all over again. News outlets started running retrospectives about my husband, about the pattern of exploitation, about the way the system had failed so many women. The prosecutor who had tried the case was interviewed, and she talked about how the involvement of family members, specifically my daughter's insistence on investigation and my own eventual action, had been crucial in building the case that resulted in conviction. I became, somewhat uncomfortably, a public figure. I gave interviews. I spoke at conferences. I became the face of Complicity Reformed, which was a role I had never asked for, but which I understood I had a responsibility to carry. Not everyone in the community was happy about the book, about the publicity, about the reopening of wounds that some people had wanted to leave closed. Some of my husband's family members came forward to defend him, to suggest that he had been treated unfairly, to question whether Isabella had been telling the truth. They didn't understand, or perhaps they didn't want to understand, the implications of what had happened. They wanted the story to go away. They wanted their family name to stop being associated with sexual exploitation. They wanted to live their lives without the constant reminder of what one of their own had done. I understood that impulse. I also understood that it was exactly the impulse that had allowed my husband to function for so long. The desire to make the problem disappear rather than actually addressing it. My daughter and I did a book tour together. We traveled to different cities, and we sat on stages, and we answered questions from audiences who had come to hear our story. The questions were often devastating in their intimacy. Women would stand up, and they would ask how they could know if their partner was being unfaithful, how they could recognize the signs of predation, how they could trust their instincts when they had been taught not to. Men would ask how they could be better allies to survivors, how they could use their privilege to support the work that organizations like Visible were doing, how they could examine their own complicity in systems of exploitation. Children would ask questions about whether they should trust the adults in their lives, about what to do if they witnessed something wrong, about how to process betrayal when it came from someone they loved. Each question was a mirror. Each question reflected back something about the work we still needed to do. One night, after a particularly difficult Q&A session, my daughter and I sat in a hotel room, and I asked her if she regretted what we had done. I asked if she wished that we had handled things differently, if she wished that we had protected the family reputation instead of exposing everything to the world. She looked at me with such clarity, and she said, "Mom, the family reputation was built on a foundation of lies. What we did was tear down that foundation so that something real could be built in its place. And yes, it's messy, and it's painful, and it's ongoing. But it's real. And real is what matters." I held her then, this woman who was my daughter, who had become such a powerful advocate for survivors, and I understood that whatever pain this had caused, whatever exposure and criticism and judgment we had endured, it had been worth it because it had led to this, to my daughter becoming someone who could hold space for other people's trauma with such grace and precision. Diego started kindergarten, and I realized that he had no memories of his father, which was both a blessing and a curse. He would ask questions sometimes about where his father was, and Isabella would answer with age-appropriate honesty. Your father made choices that meant he couldn't be the kind of dad you deserve, so he's not part of our lives. Diego seemed to accept this in the way that children do, with a pragmatism that suggested he understood on some level that there were people in the world who couldn't be trusted with other people's hearts. But I also watched him watch other children with their fathers, watched him notice the absence, watched him process what it meant to be a child without that particular presence. Isabella tried to fill the gap by making sure he had men in his life who were safe and present. My son-in-law was involved and engaged. Sarah's ex-husband volunteered with him on weekends. I made sure that Diego had multiple examples of men who could be trustworthy. I was 62 years old when I finally felt like I could breathe normally again. It took 5 years from the day I found that earring. 5 years of court cases and therapy sessions and support group meetings and difficult conversations. 5 years of rebuilding my relationship with my daughter. 5 years of learning how to be present for Isabella in ways that mattered. 5 years of watching my grandchildren slowly regain their sense of safety and joy. And when I finally felt that breath move through my chest without catching on grief or rage or guilt, I understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but the slow, incremental process of becoming someone different than you were. Someone who could live with what you had done and also work every single day to prevent it from happening to anyone else. My daughter's book had sold over 200,000 copies. It had been translated into 7 languages. It had sparked conversations in countries all over the world about family secrets, about complicity, about the ways that systems protect predators. Universities were using it in their criminal justice programs. Therapists were recommending it to clients who had experienced sexual exploitation. Survivors were reading it and recognizing themselves in the narrative, understanding that they weren't alone, that there were people who believed them, that there were pathways to justice even when the system seemed rigged against them. My daughter had become a recognized voice in conversations about trauma and healing. And while I was proud of her, I was also deeply aware that none of this should have been necessary. None of this pain should have had to be transformed into activism in order to create change. Sarah's nonprofit had expanded to include satellite offices in 5 different cities. We were training advocates, providing legal support, connecting survivors with resources, and most importantly, we were creating spaces where people could tell their stories and be believed. The organization had become self-sustaining through grant funding and individual donations. Corporate sponsors who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to survivor support were partnering with us. Universities were sending interns. Other survivors were joining the staff and bringing their own expertise and their own hard-won wisdom. I watched this ecosystem of healing develop, and I understood that this was what could happen when you took the worst thing and you refused to let it be wasted. You transformed it into something that could serve others. Isabella completed her degree and she started working on her master's in social work. She was determined to become even more credentialed, even more equipped to serve the communities that had been failed by systems designed to exploit them. She would come home from her classes exhausted but animated, talking about theories of trauma and resilience, about the neurobiology of exploitation, about the cultural and systemic factors that made certain populations more vulnerable. Diego would watch his mother study with such intensity, and I think he was learning something crucial about what it looked like to refuse to be defined by what had been done to you, about what it looked like to build a future entirely of your own making. My son-in-law had been quietly supportive throughout all of this, and I realized one day that I had never fully thanked him for what he had done. He had stood by my daughter as she investigated her father. He had supported her through the legal proceedings. He had helped her navigate the emotional minefield of writing a book that detailed betrayal by the man who had raised her. He had been present for his children as they processed trauma. He had modeled what it looked like for a man to recognize exploitation and respond with action instead of silence. One afternoon, I asked him to have coffee with me, and I told him all of this. I told him that I thought he was an example of what it meant to be a good man in a world full of bad choices made by men who had power. He looked uncomfortable with the praise, which somehow made me respect him more. He said, "I was just doing what needed to be done. That's what you do when you love people. You show up and you do what's right, even when it's hard." The grandchildren continued their individual journeys of processing and healing. My granddaughter became involved in youth advocacy work, speaking at schools about consent and boundaries and what it looked like to recognize predatory behavior in its early stages. She had transformed her own trauma into a kind of protective shield for other young people. And while I was grateful for her activism, I was also aware that she should never have had to develop this kind of sophistication about danger at such a young age. But she wore her knowledge like armor, and she used it to protect others, and I had to respect the alchemy of that transformation, even as I grieved what had made it necessary. My grandson had started volunteering with an organization that worked with incarcerated men, helping them process their own trauma and violence. He wanted to understand what made people commit the kinds of crimes his grandfather had committed. He wanted to know if there was intervention possible, if there was a way to interrupt the cycle before it fully manifested in harmful behavior. He was 19 years old, and he was already doing the intellectual and emotional work of trying to prevent future predators from existing. It was ambitious and maybe naive, but it was also beautiful in its determination to find some kind of meaning in what had happened to his family. I had started dating someone, which surprised me. His name was Robert, and he was a retired teacher who had lost his wife 5 years earlier. We met at a support group for people processing grief of various kinds, and we recognized in each other a kind of broken open quality that comes from having the foundations of your life completely dismantled. We weren't trying to recreate what we had lost. We were building something entirely new, something that was shaped by the knowledge of how fragile things actually are, how easily trust can be broken, how important it is to check in constantly with the people you love and make sure that you're still seeing them clearly. He knew about my husband, about what had happened, about my role in it. He didn't judge me. He just said that he understood how easy it was to convince yourself that things weren't what they seemed to be, how comfortable denial could be. We moved slowly and carefully, and we built something that felt real because it was built on the foundation of actually knowing each other, of actually seeing each other, of refusing to pretend. Years went by. Diego started middle school. He was a quiet, thoughtful child who had developed the kind of emotional intelligence that sometimes comes from having to process complicated family dynamics at a young age. He knew his story. His mother had made sure of that. She had never hidden the truth from him in a way that he could understand it. She had never made him feel ashamed of his origins. She had just been clear that his father had made choices, that those choices had consequences, that those consequences had affected many people, including Diego himself, but that his existence was never a mistake, never something to regret, never something to be ashamed of. Diego carried this knowledge with a kind of grace that suggested his mother had done an extraordinary job of helping him integrate the most difficult parts of his own narrative. My relationship with my daughter had evolved into something that I could only describe as deep respect mixed with ongoing accountability. She still checked in with me regularly about my feelings, my processing, my understanding of what I had done. She still held me accountable when I slipped into patterns of rationalization or self-protection. But she also demonstrated such profound compassion for the woman I was trying to become that I knew our relationship had moved beyond the original betrayal into something more authentic. We had been forced to see each other clearly, her seeing my complicity, me seeing her strength. And somehow that clarity had become the foundation for a genuinely intimate relationship. We didn't pretend anymore. We didn't perform for each other. We were just two women trying to do the right thing and failing sometimes, and trying again. 10 years after the arrest, I received an invitation to speak at a conference on trauma-informed justice. The organizers wanted me to be on a panel with a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a survivor advocate. They wanted me to talk about what it meant to be complicit, what it meant to finally act, what it meant to spend a decade rebuilding trust in yourself and in the people around you. I almost said no. I almost told them that I wasn't the right person for this, that I should be hidden away somewhere instead of speaking publicly about my failures. But my daughter told me something that stopped me cold. She said, "Mom, your voice matters precisely because you're not perfect, because you failed, because you chose wrong and then you chose differently. That's what people need to hear. They need to hear that it's possible to change even after you've been complicit." So I went to the conference. I sat on that panel in front of 400 people and I told them about the earring. I told them about the moment I knew and the months I didn't act. I told them about the calculation I made when I decided to fake dementia and call the police. I told them about the consequences that rippled out from that action, the ways it had hurt people I cared about, even as it protected them. I told them about Isabella, and about Diego, and about Sarah. I told them about my grandchildren, and about the work they were doing to prevent what had happened to them from happening to others. And when I finished, there was a silence in that room that felt sacred, like everyone was processing something together. We were all recognizing that complicity was not an individual failing, but a systemic one, that we were all implicated in structures that allowed exploitation to flourish. During the break, a woman approached me. She was maybe 40, with dark circles under her eyes, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a secret for too long. She told me that she had recognized herself in my story. She told me that she knew her husband was doing something with their nanny, that she had suspected it for months, that she had been too afraid to confront it because she didn't know what would happen to her life if she did. She asked me what I would do if I were in her position now. I took her hands and I looked her directly in the eyes and I said, I would act. I would act today. Because every day you wait is another day that young woman is being exploited. Another day your children are being exposed to predation. Another day you're teaching yourself that your instincts don't matter. Act today. She cried then, right there in the hallway of the conference center, and I held her while she processed what I had just told her. She told me that she was going to go home and she was going to confront her husband. She was going to protect the nanny. She was going to protect her children. She was going to do what I hadn't done for so many years. I gave her the phone number for one of the lawyers who had worked with Isabella. I told her to call before she confronted her husband, to have a plan, to protect herself legally. She wrote down the number with shaking hands, and she thanked me. And as I watched her walk away, I understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not absolution, but the possibility that your failure could be transformed into something that prevented someone else from making the same mistake. Isabella graduated with her master's degree. She had become the clinical director of Visible, overseeing the therapeutic services we provided to survivors. She was working with populations that most social workers avoided: undocumented immigrants, sex workers, people without stable housing, people whose trauma was compounded by systemic marginalization. She was fierce and gentle, and completely uncompromising in her commitment to these women's well-being. I watched her work with such intensity, and I thought about the young woman who had arrived at our house 5 years earlier as a babysitter, full of hope and vulnerability, completely unaware of the danger she was walking into. That woman no longer existed. In her place was someone who had survived exploitation and had transformed that survival into a mission to help others survive as well. Diego was 15 years old, and he was beginning to ask harder questions about his father. He wanted to understand what had happened, not just the sanitized version that his mother had given him when he was younger, but the actual details. Isabella consulted with me and my daughter about how to handle this, and we decided together that Diego deserved the truth. We gave him access to news articles, to court documents, to the book my daughter had written. We told him that he could ask us anything and we would answer honestly. He spent a weekend reading and processing, and then he came to us with questions. He wanted to know what kind of man his father had been before the predation. He wanted to know if there were warning signs that his father might become this person. He wanted to know if there was anything in his own DNA, his own genetics, that might mean he was capable of becoming like his father. I answered these questions as honestly as I could. I told him that his father had been charming and intelligent and capable of making people feel special. But I also told him that those qualities had been weaponized, that they had been used to manipulate and exploit. I told him that there were warning signs if you looked closely: an unusual interest in young women, a pattern of hiring attractive nannies and babysitters, inappropriate comments that were dressed up as compliments or jokes. I told him that having a predatory father didn't mean he would become a predator, that his choices were his own, that he had demonstrated more emotional intelligence and ethical consciousness in his 15 years than his father had demonstrated in his entire life. He listened to this, and then he asked me the question that I think he had been building toward. "Grandma, do you think my father was evil, or was he just a man who made bad choices?" I had to sit with that question for a moment, because it was profound and it deserved a real answer, not a platitude. I told him that I thought his father was a man who had power and who used that power to hurt people, that he was capable of rationalizing his behavior, that he had never truly faced the consequences of what he had done until the very end. I told him that I didn't believe in evil as an abstract force. I believed in choices, in the accumulation of choices, in what people chose to do when they had the opportunity to hurt someone, and they knew that person was vulnerable. I told him that his father had made those choices deliberately and repeatedly, and that made him responsible for the harm he had caused. And then I told him something that I think was the most important thing I could tell him. "But you're not your father. You're Diego. You're the son of a woman who survived exploitation and who chose to build something beautiful from that survival. And you have the opportunity to make different choices." My granddaughter had started college on a full scholarship for her activism work. She was studying criminal justice with the intention of working in policy development, of trying to change the systems that had protected her grandfather for so long. She was fierce in her determination to prevent other families from experiencing what her family had experienced. She was writing papers about the failures of institutional response to sexual exploitation. She was interning with advocacy organizations. She was becoming the kind of person who could actually change policy, who could actually shift systems. I went to her college campus to visit her one weekend, and I watched her give a presentation about consent and boundary setting. And I was struck by how clearly she could articulate concepts that I had struggled to understand for years. She had turned her trauma into expertise. My grandson had finished college, and he had decided to pursue a career in criminal psychology. He wanted to understand the minds of people who committed the kinds of crimes his grandfather had committed. He wanted to know if there was intervention possible, if there was a way to interrupt the development of predatory behavior before it reached the point of irreversible harm. He was working as an intern at a prison now, conducting interviews with men convicted of sexual crimes, trying to understand their psychological profiles, trying to identify patterns. It was difficult work, and sometimes he came home devastated by what he had heard. But he was committed to it. He believed that understanding could lead to prevention, and I respected his determination, even as I worried about the emotional toll it was taking on him. My daughter and I were invited to speak at a university about our experience and about the book she had written. We did a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session, and the questions we received were sophisticated and difficult and deeply personal. A young woman stood up and asked my daughter, "How do you forgive someone who was supposed to protect you but instead enabled exploitation in your home?" And my daughter paused, and she said something that I had never heard her articulate so clearly before. She said, "I don't think forgiveness is the right word for what I'm doing. I think what I'm doing is understanding. I understand that my mother was also a victim of my father's manipulation and control. I understand that she was operating from a place of fear and not knowledge. I understand that she didn't have the tools to recognize what was happening. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving, and I don't think I've forgiven her. What I have done is chosen to remain in relationship with her while holding her accountable for her choices. And that's much harder than forgiveness would be, because it requires ongoing negotiation and honesty and a willingness to be disappointed by people you love. 20 years after I found that earring wedged between the bathroom sink and the wall, I stood in my kitchen and I looked at a photograph that had been taken at Diego's high school graduation. He was standing between his mother and me, and we were all smiling in a way that felt genuine and earned. He had just been accepted to university on a full scholarship. He was going to study social work, following in his mother's footsteps, determined to work with vulnerable populations. He was going to build a life that had nothing to do with his father's legacy, and everything to do with the choices that Isabella had made to protect him, to raise him with integrity, to show him what it meant to survive and thrive. Looking at that photograph, I understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not a destination you reached and then stayed at, but a continuous practice of showing up, of being accountable, of choosing differently than you had chosen before. The woman I had met at the conference had come back to find me 5 years later. She had confronted her husband. She had protected the nanny. She had gone through a divorce and rebuilt her life. She had become an advocate herself, and now she was working with an organization in her own city doing the work of supporting survivors. She told me that what I had said to her in that hallway had changed her life, that she had been living with such fear before that moment, and that giving herself permission to act had freed her from that fear. She told me that she had been through therapy and that she had worked hard to understand how she had rationalized her husband's behavior for so long. She told me that she was rebuilding her relationship with her children, that they were processing their own trauma from having witnessed the violation of boundaries in their home. And she thanked me. She told me that my willingness to speak about my own complicity had given her permission to act on her own instincts. Isabella wrote a memoir. It was published by a small press initially, but it gained traction through word of mouth and through recommendations by therapists and social workers. Her book was told entirely from her perspective, what it had felt like to be groomed, what the exploitation had looked like from the inside, what it meant to survive and to become a mother and to build a career dedicated to helping others survive the same thing. She had written about me in the book, about the complicated relationship we had developed, about how I had eventually become an ally, even though I had initially been complicit. She had written about my daughter and about the support that had surrounded her. She had written about Diego and about what it meant to raise a child in the aftermath of exploitation. The book was beautiful and devastating, and it helped thousands of people understand what survivor-led advocacy looked like. My relationship with Robert had deepened into marriage. We had built a life together that was grounded in honesty and in the shared understanding that life could be taken away or transformed in an instant. So you had to be careful with how you treated the people you loved. He had become a grandfather figure to Diego, had supported my grandchildren through their various processes of healing and advocacy. He had listened to me talk through the ongoing work of accountability and redemption. He had never made me feel like my complicity was unforgivable, but he also never let me off the hook for it. He would remind me, gently, when I was starting to rationalize or minimize. He would hold me accountable while also showing me compassion. He was the kind of partner that I should have had all along, someone who could see me clearly and love me anyway. Standing at the end of this story, I want to say something directly to anyone who is listening and who recognizes themselves in this narrative. If you are someone who has known about exploitation and has chosen not to act, if you are someone who has rationalized away warning signs, if you are someone who has prioritized your own comfort over someone else's safety, it is not too late to change. It is never too late. The work will be hard. The consequences will be real. The people you love might be angry with you. But the alternative, continuing to live with that knowledge, continuing to be complicit through your silence, that cost is higher. That cost is measured in the lives of people who are being hurt right now, in this moment, while you're reading this or listening to this. Act. Pick up the phone. Call someone. Tell someone what you know. Do the thing that terrifies you, because that terror is the only thing standing between exploitation continuing and it being stopped. And if you are someone who has been exploited, who has been victimized, who has had your trust broken by someone who was supposed to protect you, I want you to know that your survival matters. Your voice matters. Your story matters. There are people who believe you. There are systems being built to support you. There are advocates who are dedicated to your healing and to preventing what happened to you from happening to others. You are not alone. You were never alone. The silence that surrounded your experience was a choice made by people who could have acted and didn't. But that silence does not erase the validity of your experience. You survived. That survival is everything. That survival is the foundation upon which new things can be built. This is where the story ends, but it is not where the work ends. The work continues every single day. My daughter continues to write and speak and advocate. Isabella continues to work with survivors and to raise a son who understands both the fragility and the resilience of human beings. Sarah continues to expand the work of Visible into new cities and new communities. My grandchildren continue to use their own trauma as a catalyst for change. And I continue to live with the knowledge of what I knew and didn't act on. And I use that knowledge to motivate me to speak, to advocate, to make sure that other people don't make the same choices I made. Because that is what accountability looks like. That is what redemption looks like. It looks like a lifetime of choosing differently, of speaking truth, of standing with survivors, of refusing to be silent. It looks like this. It looks like a story being told. It looks like you listening and recognizing yourself and deciding that you're going to do something different. It looks like change, slow and painful and necessary, rippling out into the world.